Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's video topic is a much requested one. We're looking at the life, crimes and legacy of the rebel Sir Thomas Wyatt. But before we jump in, I just want to say a massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring today's video. History Hit is like Netflix, but for history. They have hundreds of programmes online, over 1,000 podcast episodes on their award-winning podcast network, and 5,000 history-related travel articles. And new content is being added all the time because they launch 15 new podcast episodes and 2 new programmes every week. Now, whilst Dan Snow's History Hit continues to be the world's leading history podcast, they do now have 4 more podcasts, and they cover the ancients, warfare, gone medieval, and there's also Not Just the Tudors, which is hosted by Susanna Lipscomb. Speaking of Professor Lipscomb, one of the new documentaries on the History Hit platform is one that's being hosted by her, and I can't wait to watch it. It's called Becoming Anne Boleyn. And this documentary explores Anne Boleyn's early life in the hopes of discovering what made her who she was. The team was given special access to the Becoming Anne exhibition at Hever Castle for this documentary as well. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, viewers of this channel are able to get 50% off your subscription for the next 3 months by using code READINGTHEPAST. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. Now, let's discuss Sir Thomas Wyatt. Our Sir Thomas Wyatt was the only surviving son of another Sir Thomas Wyatt. The elder Wyatt was a courtier and poet during the reign of Henry VIII. He is credited as being integral to the development of the English sonnet. He was also said to have been in love with Anne Boleyn. And it would be alleged, at least some thought, that he was guilty of adultery with her. Certainly, Wyatt the Elder was scooped up and imprisoned in the Tower of London on the 5th of May, 1536. Also there by then were Anne Boleyn, her brother George, Lord Rochford, Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Richard Page, who would arrive a few days later. Only Wyatt the Elder and Page would be able to survive this suspicion. Wyatt the Younger, our subject for today, was born in or before 1521, meaning that he would have been around 14 or 15 at the time of his father's arrest and during his months of imprisonment. Wyatt the Elder was released later in 1536. We don't know what effect this event had on his son, nor do we know much of how his son was spending his time during this period, or indeed where he was. That he was educated, we can safely assume. What form his schooling took is, however, unclear. Ian W. Archer states that Wyatt the Younger, quote, seems to have been familiar with the classical military authorities, and his father recommended to him the study of moral philosophy. An uncorroborated family tradition records that he travelled in Italy, Germany and France, but the dates cannot be established. Some have stated that Wyatt the Younger was allowed to accompany his father on his embassy to the court of the Emperor Charles V, which began in 1537. This is disputed. What is certain is that the elder Wyatt became the focus of the Inquisition while he was on this embassy, as he was accused of distributing heretical books. I can understand why it would be appealing for both the Wyatts to be present when the threat of Inquisition loomed, because it would mean that, while still in his teens, the younger Wyatt would have been provided with a reason to fear, maybe hate, the government and religion that were persecuting his father before his eyes. However, it is equally possible that similar feelings could have been evoked from a distance by simply hearing about it. In either case, it offers a helpful motivation for what Wyatt the Younger would get up to in 1554. There has, however, been debate over the younger Wyatt's religion. with David Loades asserting that he was not driven by any particularly profound faith. He conformed to Edward VI's religious settlement, but might just as happily have professed his loyalty to the Roman Catholic faith in which he was raised. Whatever shaped him, I don't think it was being with his father on the embassy, principally because there are 2 letters from around this time sent by the father to the son, which presumably wouldn't need to happen if they were together. And besides, Wyatt the Younger had other business to attend to in 1537, the first year of his father's embassy, when he was around 16, because in this year he became a husband. He married Jane, daughter and co-heir of the leading Kent gentleman Sir William Oate of Bishopsbourne. When Wyatt the Younger was around 21, in 1542, his father died. From this point on, I will be referring to Wyatt the Younger as simply Wyatt. The son had been left to settle the debts of his father, which were substantial enough for him to have to sell a portion of his estate in 1543 for £3,669. Also in that year, Wyatt joined a group of other young nobles that included Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and Sir William Pickering, as they went about the streets of London at night, smashing in the windows of churches and the wealthy, and also committing acts of violence against sex workers. From the Fleet prison, Surrey would seek to defend his behaviour as being a righteous action designed to warn the citizens of London of how far they had sunk into the 7 deadly sins, idolatry and corruption. It was the message of a reformer, and perhaps it was a sentiment that had an effect on Wyatt, who was some 5 years Surrey's junior, because Wyatt found himself in added trouble around this time for ignoring the prohibition against eating meat on Fridays and fast days. For his various acts of disobedience and disorder, Wyatt was confined to the Tower of London for a month. The following year, in June 1544, he was sent to war with the French, in command of 100 men. His bravery and skill was remarked upon, and he would be knighted in the early months of 1545. If the campaign as a whole had been a success, then I think it's very likely that Wyatt would have risen further still. But as it was, the English were ultimately embarrassed by the French at St Etienne on the 7th of January 1546. Just over a year later, on the 19th of January 1547, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, the man who had been Wyatt's fellow rabble-rouser, who was his patron and military superior, the individual who bore much of the disgrace from the failures of the French campaign, was beheaded on Tower Hill for treason. 9 days later, in the early hours of the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII would die too. From the very start of the reign of King Edward VI, Wyatt enjoyed increased political prominence. In 1547, he was Knight of the Shire, or the Member of Parliament for Kent, and between 1550 and 1551, he served as a sheriff. Thus, he was able to weather the storm of regime change, when the King's uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, was replaced as the head of the government by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. At the start of 1553, King Edward VI fell ill. Over the next few months, there would be periods of recuperation, followed by ever more serious relapses. Before long, it became clear that the king was unlikely to live long. And so, work began on a new device for the succession, one that would see the king's half-sisters excluded in favour of their first cousin once removed, Lady Jane Grey. And helpfully, she had been married to Northumberland's son Guildford on the 25th of May, 1553. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553. It would later be claimed that Wyatt had opposed this device, and that he had even been threatened with being sent to Ireland because of this opposition. However, there would also be those that would claim that, at least at the start, he had offered military support to Jane's queenship. And if he had done, then he must have turned coat pretty quickly, because he would also play a part in the following days in proclaiming Mary Queen of England at Maidstone in Kent. Wyatt may have sought permission to leave the country in the early months of Mary's reign, potentially so that he could practice his reformed faith in peace. But if this did happen, then he couldn't have been away for very long. It is possible that what we have here is an attempt to press the faith-based motivations for what Wyatt is about to become embroiled in. Towards the end of 1553, word was spreading about Mary's wish to marry Philip of Spain, and this sparked widespread concern. For, after all, was it not part of the divine order that a wife must submit to her husband? Well, what did that mean if the wife were a regnant queen? Would England become wife to the Habsburg Empire and thus subordinate to it? Would Mary be expected to leave England? And what if she died, either with or without an heir? And these concerns did not only exist within the general population, because many of Mary's privy councillors, including her Lord Chancellor and Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, tried to talk her out of it. On the 16th of November, a delegation from Parliament attempted to encourage Mary to change her mind. The Queen, it seemed, was not about to be swayed. On the 26th of November 1553, a group of men gathered to discuss what might be done. All of them had been involved in the military campaigns of the 1540s, and they had enjoyed prominence during the reign of Edward VI that was not quite being matched under his half-sister. It is also possible that they were all Protestants. There was Sir Thomas Wyatt, Sir Peter Carew, Sir Edward Rogers, Sir Edward Warner, Sir William Pickering, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, Sir James Croft, Sir George Harper, Nicholas Arnold, William Thomas and William Winter. Within the month, they would be joined by Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, whose daughter, Lady Jane Grey, was still being held in the Tower of London. It is reported that rebellion was planned. It would take place on Palm Sunday, 18th of March, 1554. On this date, Sir Peter Carew would lead an uprising in the West Country. Sir James Croft would raise Herefordshire. Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, would lead in the Midlands, and Sir Thomas Wyatt would come out in Kent. When one of the conspirators, William Thomas, suggested they should assassinate Mary I, Wyatt was said to be violently opposed. It was alleged that the plan was to marry the Lady Elizabeth to Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon, and then to raise them to the throne in Mary's place. However, Wyatt would claim that he was only interested in preventing a foreign power having sway over English matters, and that Mary should be better counselled, which for some reason would require her capture. Letters passed between Wyatt and Courtenay, and it's also thought that Elizabeth was contacted to be made aware of the plan. It seems that she wrote nothing in reply, but is suspected of sending a verbal response to Wyatt. We might suppose that her words were encouraging, but we can't prove it, which was absolutely the point. As it was, the conspirators found themselves being forced into acting earlier than their intended date of the 18th of March, because the government had learned of the planned uprising before the end of 1553. On the 25th of January 1554, Wyatt called for supporters to flock to his banner at Maidstone. On the 28th of January, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the father of Wyatt's executed friend and patron Surrey, commanded a troop of around 600 from the City of London to defend against Wyatt's forces. And they managed to prevent Sir Henry Isley's men from reaching Wyatt at Rochford and thus adding to his numbers. But this didn't stop Wyatt's troops from outnumbering those that were led against him, and this disparity was only compounded when one of the Londoners' captains cried out for his troops to join with Wyatt. Now, French bribes may have had more to do with this defection than any belief in the justice of Wyatt's cause, but it, understandably, led Wyatt to believe that London would be on his side. Wyatt led a march towards the city, and they reached Southwark on the 3rd of February. They remained there until the 6th, and during this time of waiting, Wyatt had trouble holding on to and indeed growing his troop numbers. It was also becoming worryingly clear that Wyatt's was the only remaining prong of the uprising. Mary I's decision to speak at the Guildhall on the 1st of February can probably take some of the credit for ensuring the loyalty of the Londoners. Certainly, it must have disappointed, even surprised Wyatt when he found that London Bridge was defended against him and that all the rivercraft had been held away from him on the north side of the Thames. On the 6th of February, Wyatt led his remaining troops to Kingston, where, after repairing the bridge, they finally crossed the river. Equipment and troops, however, continued to be left behind and to fall away, but still Wyatt persisted. On the morning of the 7th of February 1554, those that remained marched on London. Ultimately, the rebels were corralled in a trap on Fleet Street as Ludgate was closed before them and a loyalist cavalry had arranged themselves behind them. Wyatt was asked and agreed to surrender. This rising had been a real threat to the Marian regime, and in its aftermath, the government set out to tie up any loose ends. And by that, I do mean imprison and execute as many threats as possible. But I don't necessarily think that this should be read as vengeance, because I think it was arguably motivated by a potentially rational fear that there might be more successful challenges to come. Jane Grey and Guildford Dudley were executed on the 12th of February. Jane's father was executed 11 days later on the 23rd of February. The 23rd was also the date when Mary's half-sister Elizabeth arrived at Whitehall, following a protracted journey that was delayed by her ill health. Now, some have read Elizabeth's maladies as being very conveniently timed, and so they argue that they may have been feigned. Others point out that she had good reason to fear for her life, and that the stress of this may well have generated real physical symptoms. The government set about trying to find the evidence that would convict Elizabeth. And those who advised Mary, in particular the Imperial Ambassador, Simon Renard, and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, felt that Mary's safety could only be assured if Elizabeth were dead. Mary refused to see her half-sister, and it was soon decided that Elizabeth should be moved to the Tower of London. Elizabeth tried to delay. She demanded to be given time to write a letter to Mary. In it, she professed her innocence and loyalty, and she begged to be allowed to come before her, or at least to hear from her. This missive, from the 17th of March, is known as the Tide Letter, because writing it bought Elizabeth time for the tide of the Thames to turn, which prevented her from travelling to the Tower that day. Elizabeth would receive no response from Mary, and her transfer to the Tower of London would take place the next day, on the 18th of March. It is most probable that Elizabeth was held in the same rooms that had housed her mother, Anne Boleyn, both before her coronation in 1533 and then also her execution in 1536. We don't know what, if anything, Elizabeth had been told about the particulars of her mother's death, but I think she would likely have been able to put the pieces of the Queen's apartments and the Tower of London together to draw the appropriate conclusion. Even if she didn't recognise the significance of the rooms, then I think the place itself must have filled her with terror. Elizabeth would remain at the Tower of London for 2 months, before being moved to Woodstock on the 19th of May. The 19th of May was the anniversary of her mother's execution, and there is a small part of me that wonders if this date was picked for that reason. Was it thought that if Elizabeth heard that a group were coming to see her, especially on that day, she might believe they were coming to tell her that she would be executed, as her mother had been? Might that fear, coupled with the desire to die with a clean conscience, finally obtain the evidence of her guilty complicity that the government had been seeking for months? Certainly, the authorities had chosen not to arraign Wyatt for over a month following his surrender, which some have said might indicate that they were holding off as they attempted to build a complementary case against Elizabeth. Eventually, however, Wyatt was arraigned on the 15th of March. He was executed the following month on the 11th of April 1554, Wyatt was around 33 years old. Wyatt used his scaffold speech to fully exonerate both Elizabeth and Edward Courtenay of any knowledge or part in his scheme. I do wonder how much this scaffold speech might be credited with saving Elizabeth's life. I mean, do you believe him? Do you think that Courtenay, and likely Elizabeth too, just so happened to be sending messages to a man who was planning to set them up as the married rulers of England? But that part just never came up. Because I'm not sure that I buy that. So if we don't buy it, then we have to ask, why was Wyatt prepared to die with a lie on his lips? There are reports that some of those who witnessed Wyatt's execution went up and dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood as a memento. It's also said that within a few days of his decapitated head being put on display, it had been stolen. What happened to the head remains a mystery, but some suggest that it was taken to be a martyr's relic. But Wyatt wasn't the only potential martyr that was made out of this situation. Because a lengthy section in John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, that's also known as the Book of Martyrs, is given over to the suspicion and danger that Elizabeth was subject to in her sister Mary I's reign. This section of the text bears the subtitle, quote, God's Providence in Preserving the Lady Elizabeth in Queen Mary's Time. A principal focus of this portion of the text is on her treatment in the aftermath of the failure of the Wyatt Rebellion. Fox sets the scene, quote, First, we have to consider in what extreme misery, sickness, fear, and peril Her Highness was, into what care, what trouble of mind, and what danger of death she was brought. Being fetched up as the greatest traitor in the world, clapped in the Tower. Secondly, to consider again, we have, all this notwithstanding, how strangely, or rather miraculously from danger she was delivered. What favour and grace she found with the Almighty, who, when all help of man and hope of recovery was past, stretched out his mighty protection and preserved Her Highness, and placed her in this princely seat of rest and quietness, wherein now she sitteth, and long may she sit. The Lord of his glorious mercy grant, we beseech him. In Foxe's book, Elizabeth's sufferings sit alongside the torments of those who were martyred in the name of reformed religion. I do have a video on the Book of Martyrs that I will be leaving linked, but suffice to say, the text and its woodcuts are graphic in their depictions of that suffering. And clearly, Elizabeth's tale is seen, or at least is presented, as being a fitting addition to it. This Book of Martyrs would be placed beside the Bible in English in many churches during Elizabeth's reign, as if it were an equal article of faith. Queen Elizabeth I was, I would argue, shaped as a living martyr for the Reformed Church, of which she was now named Supreme Governor. Is it possible that out of the real-life terror and the life-threatening danger that came in the aftermath of Wyatt's rebellion, Elizabeth and indeed her image makers were able to redirect this Queen's experiences into propaganda that then shored up both her governance of England's church and also her rule as that nation's Queen? But what do you think of Wyatt's motives to rebel? Why did he refuse to implicate Elizabeth and Courtenay? How involved do you think Elizabeth was? What do you think of the shaping of Elizabeth as some kind of martyr in Foxe's text? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. So follow me over on some or all of them so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you think you're subscribed, do have a little check now, just to make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why not also hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then in the drop down, hit all, so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.